So let's talk about reading the Bible in translation. If you have a copy, usually the translation is listed on the spine or in the inside. Sometimes people get really weird about translations. They get real bossy. They have very strong opinions about what are good translations, what are terrible translations. I will tell you from my perspective, I grew up in a King James only community, a community that believed that there was one English translation that was the right one, that was made a very long time ago, and that we shouldn't do anymore, that any further translations were changing things that were really important. And I will just say that I don't agree with that. As I learned more about how translation works, I took 2 years of Greek and have incredible respect for the translation process and what goes into translating something. I have a much more open-handed view now than I did in the community that I was growing up towards what counts as a good translation. How do we read well? And I will just say from the beginning, I think that the best thing that you can do if you're reading in translation is to read from more than one. It is one of the best tools that is available to us to be able to read how lots of different translators are trying to communicate the Greek or the Hebrew and bring it into English. So let's just talk about how this works, because I think if we just eliminate sometimes we can just get real weird. So if we step back and think about what do I already know about translation and how it works, I think it will help us be a little bit less weird about this. So you will see in your session guide, I've given you a piece of paper that looks like this. It says reading in translation across the top and has a spectrum. And this is all a little bit arbitrary. All translations exist somewhere along this spectrum, and they're not static. So every verse, every phrase, every paragraph, will shift a little bit, but in general, it's helpful to see a spectrum like this to know what you're reading. And what's happening is on the far left, you see on the top the word formal. And this is the kind of translation theory that's being used. So you have this spectrum when it comes to translation theory. On the far left on this spectrum is a formal translation, or what people often will call word for word, where you're trying to take one word in Hebrew, for example, and match it to one word in English. On the far other side, on the right side of your screen, it says dynamic, which often also gets referred to as a thought for thought. So you're trying to take the thought in the source language and translate it into a corresponding thought in English. The reality is that all of this is a little bit tricky. Some words are easier to translate word for word, and some words are almost impossible to do that. You have to communicate a thought. Otherwise, it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense in English. But if you look at a spectrum like this, the reason I find it's helpful is if you are wanting to explore the meaning of words or explore something that you're reading in more than one translation, I like to use a spectrum like this in order to pick something different than what you're reading right now. So my personal favorites are the NASB, partly because I was taught to use that in college. That's what I used in my college classes, and I just fell in love with it. And it tends to be more of a word-for-word translation, to the point that sometimes people laugh about how it makes such terrible English because they're so careful to try to do one word for one word. The thing that is helpful for is if you're trying to trace a word and the usage of a word in English across a whole section, it's more likely that the same word in Hebrew will be translated as the same word in English over and over and over again. So you can track word usage a little bit easier. And then on the more thought for thought side, I really like the NLT. And part of that is just like, I just enjoy how it reads, and it is different enough from what I grew up reading and from the NASB that I use a lot for study, that it helps me just hear in a new way and get out of like the ruts, defamiliarize myself with what I think the text means, and helps me just hear it in a fresh new way. And then the church that I attend, our pastor, Pastor Travis, often teaches out of the NIV, which you'll see if you look at that spectrum is kind of right in the middle. And often people will pick based off of they have different reasons for why they pick, but this is helpful so that you are aware of the spectrum and can pick things from different points so that you're getting different translation theories when you're trying to read. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message in the message link on the bottom. I clearly could nerd out about this for a long time. So what I want to do is just show you, though, that even presenting this as a very static thing is a little bit artificial. And I think that if you've taken any amount of language in high school, you actually kind of have a little bit of intuition about how this works. And I think understanding this can help you not get caught up when people try to get weird about saying that this is the only right one or this translation is terrible and is corrupting things. There are translations that go too far, and we can talk about that later, but I want to just show you what's going on. So on the bottom of your session guide, you will see something that looks like this. On the left-hand side, we have at the top source language. So when you are doing any sort of translation, you, of course, start with a source language. So the example that I want to use, because I live in California and most of us take Spanish in high school or, aware of Spanish because it's spoken so widely, starting with hola. I would guess that most people who have had any amount of exposure to Spanish have a clue about what this word means and what a formal or word-for-word equivalent of hola would be. Probably hello. And the interesting thing is that this is both, hello would be both a word-for-word and a thought-for-thought equivalent. So on the top, you have the source language. On the bottom, we have the target language, which in this case is English. And this is how, on a basic level, this is how translation works. But then you have something else like a common greeting, like muchas gracias. Clearly, my Spanish is terrible. But when it comes to this, like just in your head, think about how would that be translated? Well, this is where you can see the difference on a spectrum. So if you wanted a more word-for-word translation, you could say, much thanks. But most of us, when we translate that, would say something like thank you or thanks a lot, because you're giving up the word-for-word and the word order, preference for the word order of the source language, like saying much thanks, and instead saying how do you communicate this greeting in good English? Much thanks is terrible English. None of us talk like that. If I offer you something, you don't say much thanks. You would say thank you or thanks a lot, some phrase that is the English equivalent. And most translation works this way, that what you're trying to do is balance communicating accurately what was said, but doing it in a way that makes sense and sounds natural and normal in English. Now, it's one thing when it's spoken. When it's written, that's where it gets tricky, because you can go so far in making it good English that you have lost the actual words or phrases or sentences that are in the text. And because we care so much about the text as it was given to us, then there's a lot of care trying to sort out how do we stick with the words, the word order, and the paragraphs and the thoughts that are in the original language, and also just make it good English. Here's another example of how tricky this can be to really do translation well, and why I have so much confidence and respect in our English Bible translators. So here's an example of a phrase that I found that I don't think I can even pronounce. But you can read it on the screen. And this, I have been told, thanks to Google Translate, a word-for-word translation of this would be, I do not not have hairs on the tongue. Now, I know all of those English words, but this is one of those things where if you have too formal of a translation, you can lose all meaning altogether. Even though those are English words, I've missed the point in the source language. I have been told by Google Translate, the good translators at Google, that a good English translation of this phrase is to be blunt or direct. This happens all the time in language where we have idioms and metaphors. And the thing that translators have to wrestle with is, how do you figure out what is important to be what is the point being communicated here, and how do you make it make sense in the target language? We, as English readers, have this immense wealth of resources to us. Hundreds and hundreds, I don't even know the number of translators over time who have committed their life to reading the Bible and translating it into English. And we get to sit from the comfort of our couch and often on our phones and have access to all of it. It is embarrassing, the wealth that is available to us as Bible readers in just English translations. So the big thing that I hope that you are taking away from this is that you can have confidence in your English translation, and that whatever translation you're picking up, it is better to read it and to listen to it than to get caught up in anything. And then if you want a first next step for studying well, for reading in translation well, is to pick up a second translation, one that is different from what you normally read, and read that as well. Read them both and see how that helps you understand better and adds to your understanding of what's going on in the text. So we start by reading more than one. There are a lot of ways that you can do that. If you need help in sorting stuff out, you can look. So not only can you just pick up an actual copy and carry multiple Bibles around, the reality, though, is most of us have in our back pocket or in our purse lots of access to lots of Bible translations. And so if you want more ideas about how you can explore that, there's a couple websites that have free Bible translations. I love BibleGateway.com has a little tab where you can open up more columns. So you can open up like 4 or 5 Bible translations all right next to each other and pick from whatever translation you want and read a passage in all of them. It's available on your phone. Bible Hub is also really great. On that handout that I gave you, there's multiple websites listed, there's multiple apps, and then what I'm planning on doing is putting up on my website, hellomrsbrown.com. If you click through the links for this Bible study, under session 2, I'm going to add in some links to those and maybe make some videos if my husband helps me sort it out. To help you figure out how to navigate those if you've never done it before. There are some really fun resources on there. But at the most basic level, pick up and read the translation you have, and then talk to a friend or look online, look in an app, and find at least one other translation to read in as well.